אורן, אני אתן לך, נדבר על כל ההסכמים עם המיעוטים.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the session. A tale of three continents. Although I expect a tale of two cities, but let's speak about three continents. So we have three speakers. Professor Jeffrey Lesser from the Department of History, Emory University. Winship Distinguished Research Professor at Emory University. He has a lot of publications, many books, many articles, many edited collections. So we shall mention one. Negotiate national identity, immigrants, minorities, and the struggle. Ken. But you read that he's a distinguished professor, I believe. So, Professor Jeffrey Lesser, Winship Distinguished Research Professor, Emory University, Department of History, many books, many publications, many collections. We shall mention only one book, Negotiating National Identity, Immigrants, Minorities, and the Struggle for Ethnicity in Brazil, Durham Duke University Press. He will speak about national unity and racial divides, Brazil, and the struggle over racial democracy. Actually, the first time for me to hear about Brazil in Israel. The second speaker.
You come open to Tel Aviv University, you might listen to very many talks about Brazil.
Wonderful. I agree. The second speaker, Professor Oren Yiftachel, and Batya they will speak about the polarizing effects of ethnocratic policies in the case of Sri Lanka. Again, Sri Lanka, the first time to hear about Sri Lanka here. What is your reaction about Sri Lanka? The same? Good. So, Oren is professor in the Department of Geography at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Sheva. Again, a lot of books, a lot of publications, 5 books, 5 edited books, chapters, and many articles. We shall mention only the last one, Ethnocracy, Land and the Politics of Identity, Israel-Palestine, Penn Press, 2006. And last but not least, we have a lady here. She just finished her PhD? A year ago. It's almost the same. Welcome to the club. Dr. Ayelet Harel-Shalev. She is a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University and Politics and Government Department Ben-Gurion University, and she mentioned that next year she'll be in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion, and Jerusalem. Wonderful. And she will speak about citizenship in plural societies, Hindus and Muslims in India as a case study. So I'm going to be a very firm chair. We shall give 20 minutes to each of you, and then we shall open the floor to questions. Okay? Jeffrey, please.
All right. Thank you. Oh, you would like to go there? You prefer that you're the boss.
Go there.
Yes, sir. Oops. Thank you all. First of all, I know I speak for everyone at the conference when I thank Professor Tamarakin for the invitation and the hospitality to be here, and Marcelo for all the hard work for setting things up. When I was preparing for this conference, like many of you, you submit an abstract, but then you have second, third, and fourth thoughts about it. And my original idea I started to question a bit, because I started thinking about the title of the conference and this link between ethnicity, nationalism, and divided societies. And I prepared a paper, which I'm not going to deliver, don't worry, but actually about quite an interesting topic, which is about a very large movement in Brazil after World War II, a movement of about 100,000 people, who believed that Japan had won World War II. And the reason I was interested in them in this conference was the presumption that critical to the discussion here was violence. And I was interested in this movement because they assassinated people, because they blew up buildings, because they burned down farms. But then in listening to the opening lectures yesterday, I regained a little self-confidence in the topic I originally submitted. And I regained it for two reasons. First, because I really found Professor Ben Israel's idea that perhaps citizenship was the factor that ameliorated violence a challenging one. And I'm not sure I'm going to agree with it in my paper, but I think it's an important question, this idea of citizenship. And the second thing that I found very challenging was Professor James' concept that we had to push the assumptions of the buzzwords in the title of the conference, right? The three big buzzwords, ethnicity, nationalism, and divided societies. And as I thought about my paper, I realized in a way that I could push them even farther than what he was pushing us to do. So with that, I'll return to my original idea, which is to talk about the struggle over racial democracy in Brazil. The theme of this conference, ethnicity and nationalism in divided societies, might make having a paper on Brazil seem a surprise. Brazil is rarely put in the divided category, and in fact, it's often glossed for its national unity, especially in World Cup years like this one. It's also rarely thought of as an ethnic country, although it is certainly racialized, often being referred to as having the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. It's also referred to as having the largest Japanese population of Japanese descent outside of Japan, as I'm sure you all know. Even the racialization of Brazil, however, is tempered through the notion of racial democracy, a concept developed in large part from Gilberto Freire's nationalist myth-making in the book The Masters and the Slaves, and reinforced in a post-World War II UNESCO study that suggested that Brazil was a location of positive race relations. This kind of myth-making reformulated intolerance in Brazil as primarily a class issue, and thus socially ascendant individuals and groups could not be victims of racism. They also highlighted the concept that class changes race. The anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro tells of a cocktail party conversation between a famous painter and a young Afro-Brazilian diplomat complaining about racial barriers to his ascension. "I understand your case perfectly, my dear boy," the famous painter is said to have said. "I was black once too." Today, however, I'd like to suggest that Brazil is a perfect subject for the topic of this conference, exactly because divisions over ethnicity and nationalism are not open. It stands as a radical contrast to everything we've heard so far. Thus, unlike the many papers that have focused on violent conflicts and open hostility, the Brazilian case shows how questions over or divisions over ethnicity can in fact be hidden by agreement over the single national identity, right? So in other words, unlike the presumption that at least I understood from the title in which ethnicity leads to nationalism leads to division, here we have ethnic division in which all parties are in perfect agreement of the national idea. So it's a very different kind of case. In order to talk about this, I'm going to tell a story about the 1920s. I'm a historian, and so I like the past. And it's a story about when, in the early 1920s, a group of African Americans from the United States decided to apply for immigrant visas to Brazil. Now, according to Brazilian law at the time, Americans, i.e. U.S. citizens, to return to our first paper, had a legal right to enter and settle in Brazil, regardless of their racial background. Following the abolition of slavery, on the other hand, this, as many of you probably know, Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, only at the end of the 19th century. So following the abolition of slavery, Brazilian immigration policy had been to whiten the country by encouraging the entry of European laborers and banning African and Asians. This created a contradiction. What would you then do when black Americans were going to enter a country which legally banned Africans. And that's really the question of the story, and I think the question that teaches us about ethnicity, nationalism, and divided societies. The societal divide became clear in 1921 when the Brazilian-American Colonization Syndicate, which I'll call the BACS, a land development company owned by a group of African Americans from Chicago, set out to purchase land and set up a colony in Brazil. The BACS mistakenly believed that Brazil's worldwide promotion of colonization did not have racial undertones, a view reinforced by numerous African Americans who visited Brazil and claimed that it was free of racism, often making it out to be a racial paradise. Remember the story I told, I used to be black once too? Well, black Americans who visited Brazil discovered that they used to be black once too, but they didn't realize it. In other words, they would go to Brazil, be treated in a way that they were never treated in the segregated United States of the 1920s, and not realize the phenomena that had taken place. This mistaken notion and the promise of the Brazilian government to give free visas and rail and sea transportation to all immigrants led a number of African American groups, including the ones led by W.E.B. Du Bois, to encourage blacks who wanted liberty and wealth in a land of plenty to purchase land in Brazil. When the BACS made its initial application for visas, Brazil's foreign ministry, the Itamaraty, was faced with the problems of creating a legal means by which to reject the group without creating an international furor which might call into question Brazil's supposed lack of racism. So now we turn to the transnational issues that Paul quite properly brought up. The projection of an image of racial harmony was needed, so Brazilian policymakers believed, to attract white immigrants and foreign investment. Itamaraty's first solution to the request for visas from black Americans was a simple one. It would just refuse to grant them and hope the problem would go away. The hope that this response without an explanation would work, they were wrong. It didn't work. In fact, the instructions not to give visas to black immigrants to Brazil from the United States, but not explain why, was leaked by employees in the United States, some of whom were African American, and then leaked to newspapers throughout the world. So in other words, what was supposed to be this very quiet means of, again, we see here, how do you hide a racial society, right? Well, one way is through secrets, right? Don't admit to it. But, in fact, in the transnational world of the 1920s, it turned out to be not quite that simple. When it came to the fore what was going on, the Brazilian-American Colonization Syndicate began to question the policy publicly, hoping it would resolve the problem. This left the Brazilian government with a complicated and embarrassing problem. The original framers of the racist legislation or the racist policy never envisioned that a group of influential, educated U.S. citizens of African descent would try to set up a colony in Brazil. Furthermore, they never anticipated that a group of foreign blacks would know how to manipulate Brazilian legal documentation well enough to confront the government on its own terms. When lawyers from the BACS went to the Brazilian embassy in Washington with a treaty Brazil had signed, remember the treaty that gave all Americans the right to immigrate, the Brazilian government was forced into a legal and diplomatic corner. Not surprisingly, Brazil's foreign ministry went to extraordinary length to dismiss the claim. A 4-page legal brief indicates how concerned the Brazilian government was with the potential ramifications of its own ban on black immigration, and how fearful it was that public discussion of the issue would create both domestic and international problems. The foreign ministry reinforced its case by attempting to link Brazilian policy with existing racist immigration in the United States, pointing to the U.S. prohibition on Chinese immigration, which happened after the United States went through a very complicated series of treaty revocations. Itamaraty argued that its policy about black Americans was just like that of the United States vis-a-vis Chinese. Why did they take this approach? Why would Brazil, a country deeply invested in its promotion of racial harmony, and invested in it in a way that compared with the segregation and lynchings taking place in the United States at the time, getting to a discussion of Chinese, right? What's the phenomena that's going on here? One reason was that, obviously, it put the United States in a defensive position. But I think there's actually another phenomena going on here, which is the kinds of groups which become acceptable when you're going to hide your divisions and the kind of groups that aren't. In other words, if you're going to make a claim in the 1920s, let's say, that you're a society without racial discrimination, saying we don't want Chinese, like we don't want blacks, works a lot better than, for example, saying we don't want Germans, we don't want French, right? In other words, you move out of the international power realms and you move into groups without a lot of power. The complicated legal maneuvering and interpretation of treaties and constitutions did little to convince those who were denied visas that Brazil was anything less than racist. These reactions, however, meant little to the Brazilian policymakers. It was far more concerned about the maintenance of Brazil's image as a country of racial harmony. Thus, Itamaraty had to make even more arguments that would be accepted internationally. So it moved from the argument about the Chinese to a broader one, suggesting that black Americans were actually radicals in nature, communists specifically, and that to allow them in would bring subversive ideas into Brazil, and this made them undesirable. In fact, it was quite fascinating to do the research, because the way the research on this project worked out is we found the first indications in the Du Bois archives in the United States. From there, we were able, this was still at the end of the dictatorship, to do the things that sometimes you do in Brazil to get into archives, and find these papers from the 1920s that were, I don't think anybody had opened them in, 50 or 60 years. And it was in those papers where we saw the Brazilian government colluding with the United States government to define these black Americans as Jewish communists. So again, we have a fascinating idea of the way racial change works, right? So I once was black, here we have blacks becoming Jewish communists. This became the perfect means by which to hide the divided society, right? To talk about ethnicity without talking about ethnicity, to talk about the nation in a way that most people would agree to, right? Who wants subversives in their country, right? But in fact, to create a divided society. Now, throughout the 1920s, the situation of black Americans trying to enter Brazil continued. In 1923, Robert Abbott, the African-American owner-publisher of the Chicago Defender, visited Brazil, and there, yet again, he stopped being black and was treated as a king. He used his newspaper to encourage readers to immigrate to Brazil, and yet again a furor started. Rio de Janeiro's newspaper, O País, The Nation, right, interesting name for this conference, while complimenting Abbott's intelligence and politeness, rejected his ideas out of hand. We thank him for his kind comments about our people, but this is an idea to be combated. It will be one more serious problem to be resolved if in the future Negroes are permitted to immigrate to Brazil. Black North Americans will establish here exactly the conflicts that we do not have. Right? This is a rather amazing kind of ethnic discourse, right? So the idea is we have no racial problems here. But if we take black Americans from a country that has racial problems, they will import it and create the racial problems we don't have. You can take it for what it's worth. Abbott's efforts over the course of the 20s were unsuccessful, and African Americans applying for immigrant and tourist visas continued to be rejected on a regular basis. Although protests from African Americans were denied visas were rare during this period, complaints eventually mounted. In 1924, the United States ambassador became involved, and in 1926, Du Bois actually took the Brazilian government to court, but it was of no matter. In fact, the U.S. government pushed the courts not to accept Du Bois's case because they, like the Brazilians, were eager in maintaining the fiction of an ethnically undivided society that was in fact deeply divided. By 1930, the two components necessary for the effective enforcement of racist immigration regulations that would not cause an international outcry had been institutionalized in Brazil. Using the terms of this conference, the society divided along ethnic lines but was masked by nationalism. Policies allowed blacks to receive visas if the issuing consulate consulted the Brazilian government directly, but that never actually happened. Over the course of time, not only were blacks denied visas, but Jews, Indians, we're about to hear about that, Arabs, and other groups from Brazil, all within the broad context of Brazil as the leading light of racial democracy. The use of applied law to manipulate the racial composition of Brazilian society belies claims that Brazilian immigration legislation was subordinate and unrelated to practice. On the contrary, the interpretation of immigration law and the rejection of African American visa applications in the 20s was to set a precedent, as I just said. By the 30s and 40s, secret restrictive immigration orders against Jews, Indians, and even the Portuguese, based on ethnic, not national definitions, took place. These remained in practice until at least 1945. I actually think they were going on until at least 1960. Even, and this is what's important here, even as members of all those groups in Brazil agreed wholeheartedly that, their nationalism was fervently Brazilian. Okay? And that's where I think this case presents the real difference from the other ones we've heard. What we don't have in Brazil are different groups saying there should be no Brazil. We need to have Jew land and black land and Japanese land. Rather, all of these groups in Brazil, who are citizens, engage in the discourse of racial democracy. Even as doing that, or in doing that, it allows, in fact, these ethnic divisions to be exaggerated by the state. With that, I thank you.
You still have 2 minutes.
Well, they've heard enough. I know academics love to talk, and he said he wanted 20 minutes extra.
An Israeli response, you know. Mr. Chairman, maybe you want to
move.
Just to adjust. Thank you very much. Is it working? I also want to thank the organizers. I think it's a very good format for a conference to have the same people in the same sessions and building up a debate. And it's very well designed, Marcello and Moti. And also I want to thank David Lurie, who is here, no? That I met today, that is also one of the organizers behind the scene. I want to follow in my lecture that is titled The Polarizing Effect of Ethnocratic Policies, to follow some of the themes and to weave together several arguments and hopefully to progress our discussion forward with the case of Sri Lanka as a locus of both theoretical and empirical discussion. I want to foreground with the methodological comment that, of course, every category that I use is contested and it's dynamic and it's constructed through social processes. It's not ever taken as given or as a dichotomous. We are, in the words, shades of many, many colors, and these categories just help us to understand the world or to highlight critically the components that, that we wish to discuss. We start with the first shot of the flag of Sri Lanka, which is illustrative in many ways to the argument about ethnocratic societies that on one hand have a facade of a democracy, on the other hand have material political processes that are aimed to marginalize, oppress certain groups, and through the mechanism of the state promote the interest of an ethnic, national, usually ethnic national group, but not confined to the territory of the state, sometimes the group and its diasporas. The lion is both a Sinhalese, the Majority group is Sinhalese group, it's about 74% of the population. Tamil groups are about 18%, although they divided into two categories of Indian and Sri Lankan Tamils, and there's also Muslims, Moors, who are about 7% of the population. It's not a direct overlap of religion and ethnicity, but it's almost a direct overlap, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is a Sinhalese and a Buddhist symbol due to the myth of, by the way, I really apologize, Batya Roded, my co-author, is sitting there, and I'd like to thank her first and foremost. Why are you hiding there, Batya? So what was the name of the king that rode the lion? Yeah, okay, so you heard the name of the king who defeated the Tamil king at the time. So it's both national and religious. The bow leaves is a tree that is associated with Buddhism, which is the religion of the majority, which is, and that's one of the arguments, has become an ethnic religion, which is related to Hedva Ben Israel's talk yesterday about her combination of ethnicity, nationalism, and religion, and I'll say more on it in a minute. These are the token gestures to the minority. The green is the Muslim, the orange is the Tamils. They're sort of there, they're on the side. The rest is definitely a flavor of a Buddhist Sinhalese state, which is one of the main issues, bones of contentions in Sri Lanka. This is just to show you how contemporary things are. 3 days ago in the paper, in the daily news, emergency conference called by Mahinda, the new president of Sri Lanka, to discuss devolution of the Sri Lankan state. This follows an election campaign a few months ago where Mahinda campaigned against revolution, for a centralist, continuing a centralist Sri Lanka state vis-a-vis the Tamil rebellions. The other candidates, Ranil, actually campaigned on a federalist ticket. And here, a few months after the election, Mahinda is calling, because of the impending violence and the fact that there's no other possible way forward for devolution of the state, which again show the contradiction of the bravado of ethno-nationalism and the practicalities of trying to accommodate the minorities. So after this open air, I'd like to map my short talk. I want to make a few arguments. Theoretically, I want to make a very short critique that people have to read about theories of nationalism that I claim they're inadequate to explain the events in certain type of society that I call ethnocratic society. I'll focus on these, although there are other problems with nationalism theories. I want to develop in a few minutes the idea of ethnocratic regimes, to look at the role of space, the critical role of space in developing and shaping, and to also look at the main argument is that ethnocratic societies that are a very pure expression of the nationalist idea, which is the governing political geography of the world, in a sense that every nation should have a state and controls its homeland. Those kind of policies based on this system are polarizing, and ethnocratic states often, after a short term of controlling the minorities through this kind of mobilization, face a juncture, a crossroads, where they have to decide whether to continue the oppression of the minorities, but that often leads to short-term gains but long-term collapse, or to democratize, which is a difficult situation for the elites, because they have to change the idea of what the state is about and what their identity is about. And in a comparative study that I'm conducting, I'll look at Estonia, Israel, Serbia, and Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is one of the cases where, faced with this option, the Sri Lankan elites, not without exception, have decided to continue and oppress the ethnocratic option and marginalize and oppress the minorities in order to save the state, so to speak. And this has, in fact, a grave polarizing effect with incredible costs to economy and, of course, human life. Let's talk first very briefly about the problem of theories of nationalism. And of course, it's a huge body of work. My critical approach is coming from what I characterize as a neo-Gramscian angle, which looks at the materiality and identity as related to politics and try to expose what's behind the hegemony, what's behind the taken for granted truth. But also on the work of Michael Mann, of Giorgio Agamben, and other great scholars, some of them sitting here, so I'm a bit shy. The critique is, first of all, that most nationalism theories and most of the lectures here too have unduly collapsed nation and state. This is quite an old critique, but it continues to resonate. Gellner, Anderson, Smith, even Brubaker in his work that does acknowledge the existing of diaspora still talks about a nationalizing state. And in that respect, I think they overlook the existence of certain type of regimes which attempt to prevent the overlapping of nation and state. The main project, these are the ethnocratic regimes, the main project is to expand the control of the leading ethnic group and to continue the marginalization of minorities. The greatest fear is either the assimilation of minorities or the onset of equal citizenship. They work actively to prevent this from happening, quite often in subtle ways, much to do with geography and culture and immigration and law. They have the facade of democracy, but nationalism theories don't give enough space to this kind of regimes that actually attempt continuously to prevent the overlapping of nation and state. These kind of theories also take for granted the territorial nature of the state. That is, that there is a group of political community which is governed by the nation state. That is, that there is a demos of empowered citizens. And they belittle these theories, the rupturing impact of religion, of colonialism, internal and external, of immigration, of globalization, and other forces. Also we heard yesterday with Paul James, the new networks that constantly rupture the demos and prevent the possibility of the horizon of the nation state, the redemption, the future that we hope for. These theories flatten unduly what I call active space. That is, they look at space as some kind of a platform on which the drama of nationalism is happening. And I would like to impress on you that space is not a platform, but space is actually an active player in this process. It's a constant process of the making of regions, the making of borders, the making of diasporas. These are constantly processes that are happening under the frameworks of power. And in that respect, space creates society, and society creates space in a continual mutual process. And I'd like to show you how this manifests in Sri Lanka. One important factor of space is what we call in geography the Jarrow Body. The Jarrow Body is the most powerful symbol, which is usually the shape of the territory, the contested territory that is claimed by the ethnic majority as their homeland. Of course, it's contested, but it's claimed as their, and theirs only. Theirs only for the people that are on the land and the diasporas at the expense of the minorities that are there. And Sri Lanka is a case in point, and so are Serbia and Israel and other ethnocratic states. Let's have a look at the... Okay, here is one sign from Sri Lanka of my recent trip there. Let us rebuild our nation. And this is a Jarrow Body, this is the island, this is a sacred island for Sinhalese people and for Buddhist people. Of course, it's made sacred through the political struggle. And this is another factor that is very important, where political geography is a great mobilizer of both ethnic nationalism and of wiping out the existence of minorities. They are never there. Our nation is a Sinhalese nation. This is post-tsunami. As you see, the red line is where the tsunami hit, which is an interesting ethnic factor also in the tsunami aid that actually made the Sri Lankan government collapse around the issue of Tamil-controlled areas. But the nation is not a Tamil nation. The nation is our Sinhalese nation. And this is an important factor. So going back, finishing this small theoretical section and responding to some of the comments that were here yesterday and today, I like to impress on you, if we abstract down what is nationalism about and why is it so successful or powerful and why is ethnicity comes to the fore. Why is it that when it rains, to use a metaphor, in most places we see, say, red flowers flowering and not other flowers. We have to explain that. We have to explain that why ethnicity is the one that is usually mobilizes people, not always, of course, but it's such a major force. And I would like to pin that down on the triad relation between space, power, and identity. That is, these are three major driving forces. To get to power in the current political geography of the world, in the current regime, international regime, identity has to assert control over space in order to gain power, be it at the local, at the regional, at the province, at the state level, and beyond. And therefore, ethnicity, which is a collective imagined identity that is always linked to place, has such incredible mobilizing power. Of course, it's often invented. Of course, it's often reshaped. But it's nonetheless a very important factor, as illustrated in Sri Lanka, Israel, Serbia, Malaysia, Kashmir, and Northern Ireland, and many other places. Importantly here, these are non-reducible to one another. And each one of them is dynamic. The making of space, the making of power and of identities are changing all the time. But, for example, here, the whole issue of globalization creates new magnets of power that change what the meaning of power is all the time. So I think when we take this, we have to take this as dynamic. But importantly, and to link to Professor James' talk, globalization has increased rapidly the movement of capital and culture, but not people. In a recent UN survey, it shows that only 3.5% of the people in the world live in the country where they weren't born. Okay? And despite the increase of immigration, it's still a small minority. The vast majority of the world populations are trapped, if you like, in their own territories, under their own government. And hence, that kind of territory becomes such a locus of power. The repository of power is in the state, albeit changing, weakening, and rupturing. But when we look at globalization, we have to look at the mismatch between information, culture, and capital, and their movement, and the relative entrapment of people, which brings me back to Sri Lanka and the other struggles over space. One more word about ethnocracy. So I define ethnocracy as a regime that, despite democratic representation, a dominant ethno-national group appropriates the state to facilitate its expansion and ethnicization. So, you know, there are various ways that ethnic group can exert its control. Obviously, spatial expansion is one, economic domination, but I also like to talk about ethnicization because not only it's to bring part of the state and the population under its control, it's also to racialize other group, to ethnicize other group. That is to create very sharp boundaries, legal, social, cultural, between the majority and the minorities, and to never let these boundaries down. And we find that in all the ethnocratic societies that we study. And when Estonia, for example, is starting to lower this, it actually is losing its ethnocratic status. It's democratizing. It's actually allowing the Russian minority to integrate into Estonia, slow and full of problems, but nonetheless, it has crossed that Rubicon. When other societies, like Israel, Palestine, like Serbia, like, okay. So this is the ethnocratic regime. You can read much about that. And let's move now. Here we have Sri Lanka. This is perhaps the maximal claim of the Tamil minority, claim for a homeland, as developed into a claim for independence. And these are the provinces of the island state. 19 million people, but 3/4 of it Sinhalese, as I said before. The rest minorities. The constitution gives state religion status to Buddhism, and these are all the specification. And here perhaps it's important to note the issue of ethnic religion. Ethnic religion is a process where ethnicity actually mobilizes religious criteria as objective boundaries where they can actually separate the minorities from the myth-making and the resource allocation of the state. It has tensions with the state too, because normally ethnic and religious horizons are different. The horizon of the religion is not the state. It's usually something much more cosmic. But they have coalitions, and they're very powerful in excluding others from the conflict over the state. There's a more statement by a Sri Lankan leader about how Sri Lanka is inherently and rightfully a Sinhalese state, and this is in the Sri Lankan Museum, the footsteps, supposedly the footsteps of Buddha, which actually sanctify the whole island as a Buddhist place, and without where the presence of minorities is actually very problematic for the Buddhist idea. So Buddhist is actually Sinhalese; it's synonymous, like Jewish and Zionist and many other. This is the temple where you actually have the tooth of Buddha, but and you see the landscape is very Buddhist. A few more slides about the actual geography. These are the regions that Tamils have either a majority or a plurality. But you see that it's much more complex than just claim for total majority. And then if you go to some of the, you focus your magnifying glass a little bit lower, you see that several areas like Trikomali are very mixed, even inside the Tamil area. And this is, of course, the cause of the problem, which I will in 1 or 2 minutes explain in historical terms. 1948, 2 minutes, okay. 1948, Sri Lanka is declared as independent. Very quickly, the agenda of democracy and a Sinhalese state start to clash. A series of constitutional and legal decisions they declare Sinhala as the only official language, excluding the Tamil language. Buddhism is the state religion. Constitutional changes give more power to the executive, and the minority becomes restless, more restless. In 1978, the majority actually ejects the minority from the government, and in protest, all Tamils leave the parliament. And this is very important. And from then, almost until now, with a couple of exceptions, they have boycotted the political process. And this is one of the important polarizing effects of ethnocratic societies and states, because the minority feels that being in the parliament, it actually gives legitimacy to the claim for democracy. And in fact, they decide to boycott it. In the last election, end of 2005, the Tamil Tigers have also decided to boycott the election, and they gave the victory to the right wing, to the people that actually oppose the Tamils, because the election was very close, 52 to 48. So the polarizing effect continues, and several constitutional changes always are too little and too late. In 1987, they decided to create provinces, but without real power. And several talks during the very bloody civil war, where casualties are estimated to be between 70 and 80,000, always cannot square the circle, where Tamils' demands have hardened for total independence, and the Sinhalese government is continuing to demand full Sinhalese control over the whole island. Until a truce is declared in 2002, and we are now in that kind of twilight zone. People comment because of the last election, and you saw the emergency meeting of Mahinda now is trying to call that there is a process of devolution maybe in the offing, but we are in this twilight zone, that there is a truce, but it's about to erupt again into armed conflict. And on that note, with promise that all these other details will be in the paper, I'll end just on showing you one of my drawings, that one of the main problems is that how nationalized, ethnicized territories actually affected people's mind fatally, I think. Thank you very much. יש שאלה למרקו וגם נסגור את ה... קודם צריך לצאת.
Okay, my name is Ayelet again, and I will speak about the Hindu-Muslim divide in India. The title, Some Observation on Citizenship in Plural Societies, Hindus and Muslims in India as a Case Study. India represents a major enigma for scholars of political science. It is exceptional because despite being a huge democracy with ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities burdened by internal and international conflicts, and despite of poverty, widespread illiteracy, and deeply hierarchic social structure, it continues to function as a single political entity, but also as constitutional democratic state. Through my research, I attempted to trace the political formula that characterize the relations of minority-majority relations in India and try to map out the mechanism that enable India to survive and maintain governmental legitimacy while sustaining democratic process in the face of religious and ethnic conflicts. I need to apologize because due to the time limit I need to make some generalizations, but I will be more than happy to get into the small details during the discussion phase. If we look an incisive look at the world map, it shows that while most states feature deeply divided societies, only a few have managed to sustain democratic regimes over a lengthy period of time, more than 50 years. Among these states, we can count Switzerland, Belgium, Canada, India, and Israel. The first three, Switzerland, Belgium, and Canada, have been labeled in several occasions as consociational or accommodational, based on Leibhart's model. Disputes in consociational democracies are managed by jointly ruling elites representing all population sectors, and government is based on proportional rather than majority rule, with each social structure usually enjoying veto rights and measure of autonomy. According to Leiphart, while such governmental mechanism cannot warrant stability, it is the only possible guarantee for preservation of democracy in ethnically and religiously divided societies. Of the aforementioned 5 states, India and Israel are the only states whose founding father opt not to establish consociational democracy as the framework for the major scheme or major conflict in the state. In the case of India, the Hindu dominant leaders rejected pleas made by their Muslim peers such as Muslim League's Muhammad Ali Jinnah to establish a joint Hindu-Muslim regime. This decision compelled Muslims, headed by Jinnah, to strive to achieve a separate independent state, Pakistan. The partition of colonial India was accompanied by violence and mass migration of both sides of partition line. 2 independent states were eventually founded. India proclaimed itself as religiously neutral, whereas Pakistan declared itself as a Muslim state. Muslims who remained in independent India thus constitute a small minority in the face of a large Hindu majority. Neither India nor Israel can be defined as consociational or accommodational democracies as a whole, especially with respect to the major scheme. One can find some local consociational pact in Indian politics, especially among the different Hindu castes, but it cannot be considered consociational. So how can it survive? Another major proof for this term can be found in the Indian public policy. Although the Indian constitution is one of the most liberal extant, each time the Muslim leadership in India attempts to institute proportional arrangement or even affirmative action in the government or the public sector, it is treated as an initiative that will inevitably lead to a second partition. While the state practices affirmative action for several castes and social statuses within the Hindu sect, it prohibits implementation for similar policy regarding religious minorities. India's regime contains many contradictions. The main contradiction concerns the gap between the formal definition of the state and the implementation of public policy in practice. Although India is defined as a secular state that does not involve religion and politics, and although it has been established by its founding fathers as Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi as a state of all its citizens, the major part of the dominant Hindu community in India, especially since Nehru's death, consider themselves as the legitimate owner of the state, the core nation in Brubaker's term, or the true sons of the soil. Such perceptions suggest the special status of the non-assimilated minorities in India, especially the large Muslim minority, which their beliefs and origin are identical to the Pakistani enemy and to Kashmir's problem makers. We're talking about a minority of 140 million people. This community is often looked upon by right-wingers as a fifth column or as a group having another country to move to. There are many social schemes in India: ethnic, linguistic, regional, caste-based, and religious. Despite the intense challenges from social schemes and stratification through economic crisis and wars to religious extremism, the democratic ethos in India has remained the major, one could say indispensable, part of India's political system and self-identity throughout the course of nation building. Moreover, most of its conflict remain mainly at the local level and do not spread to the entire subcontinent. All except one, the Hindu-Muslim divide. The conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India is the major scheme that threatens the survival of the Indian democracy. I will present here a short analysis based on a comparison of public, judicial, and political policies toward the Muslim minorities in several policy domains following fieldwork conducted in India. In order to outline the uniqueness of Hindu-Muslim relations in India, although my PhD research deals with a comparison between India and Israel, but this is a different story. India was established in the midst of a violent partition process and severe competition between Hindus and Muslims. During the early meeting of its Constituent Assembly, it was consequently decided to cancel the transnational status of the Urdu language, which was identified with Muslims, and retain Hindi, and not Hindustani, as the sole official transnational language parallel to English. Moreover, India avoided recognition of its minorities as national minorities in a political sense. Rather, they limited recognition to the cultural, religious, and linguistic spheres. Still, India invites all Muslims remaining within the boundaries of India to continue living as citizens, enjoying equal rights, irrespective of antipathy expressed by Hindus who held the Muslims responsible for the subcontinent partition. The dominant leadership advocated unity in diversity, as well as political and cultural tolerance. Despite the appearance of nationalist movement aspiring to retreat from this model, the state has remained formally committed to this constitutional principle, associated as it is with equality and secularism. The Indian state grants equal civic rights to all citizens, regardless of religion or ethnic origin. India has established liberal rights and universal citizenship in line with its self-definition as a secular state. Nevertheless, in practice, Indian governance rests on majoritarianism as its main governing principle, and often prefers the Hindu community and displays attitudes opposing equality and universal citizenship. Affirmative action, as aforementioned, is extended to members of lower caste Hindus, although Muslims, as a separate, weak, and underrepresented community, are ineligible for its benefit. Every current call for affirmative action regarding Muslims has been perceived as a demand for further partition of India. We mustn't forget, though, that India recognized minorities' collective rights and autonomy. India recognized the autonomy of religious minorities within the spheres of education and religion, resulting in the award of rights that have sometimes conflicted with the state's liberal role. In effect, minorities enjoy more collective rights than does the majority. The Constituent Assembly formulated the Constitution in the expectation that the majority would forego these rights for the sake of Indian unity. Hindus are, consequently, not entitled to autonomously manage their education system or even their holy places. The state will do that for them. Moreover, regarding the religious sphere, the situation is even more complicated. The Constitution guarantees major autonomy to its religious minorities. It promises the minorities the freedom to manage themselves their religious affair. At the same time, the Constitution terms in Article 44 that the state shall endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code for the territory of India. This article remained a recommendation until now. In this domain, the state has constituted a civic law for Hindus, which adjusts Hinduism to the democratic principles. For example, the newly Hindu Civic Code prohibits untouchability, it prohibits discrimination in the entrance of temples, and so on. It prohibits polygamy and other non-democratic customs. In this sense, the state has nationalized Hinduism, and the government took the authority to reform these extreme civic and marriage laws. Although it has tried, the state did not interfere thus far with Muslim marriage and religious law. This created an incomparable situation that Muslims in India are entitled to polygamy while Hindus are prohibited of marrying more than one wife. Muslims are committed to the Sharia, while Hindus must obey the state civic law. Similarly, no separate Hindu education system has been established. Instead, the public governmental system is offered to the dominant majority.
Is there polygamy among the Muslims?
Of course there is.
Not always.
Oho, I would say in Hebrew. This act of nationalization, nevertheless, indicates that the state essentially views Hindus as the state and minorities as foreign elements. In denying enforcement of affirmative action for Muslims in the spheres of political representation or public employment, at the same time that it prohibits Hindus from establishing a separate and autonomous education system, the Constitution, which stresses so-called secularism as well as minority protection, intensifies the conflict between the two governance principles, while it brings about ideological conflict and resource competition. At the same time, India's self-definition as secular, despite the vagueness of the term, has in effect succeeded in creating a sense of sharing in the collective good. Muslim symbols are included in the national symbols as the national flag and national holidays, and 3 Muslim representatives were nominated as presidents of the Indian Republic thus far. Despite the numerous rights that entitle to the Muslim minority, the Indian governments, however, display a serious gap between the quality of the protection it provides to the majority and the quality of the protection it provides to minorities. Sadly, communal violence between Hindus and Muslims are very frequent. From independence onwards, more than 10,000 citizens were killed in communal violence, not including the partition between India and Pakistan, which cost the lives of 500,000. Most of the victims are Muslims. Since independence onwards, India witnessed every year many communal disturbances, which become more common after Nehru's death in 1964. But they are frequent all over India, both under the Congress Party-led coalitions as well as under the rightist BJP leadership. In many instances has been observed in which security forces have been passive in the presence of violent disturbances and injury inflicted by Hindus on Muslims' persons and properties. Moreover, various agencies in the Indian security forces have been actively involved in intercommunal violence against Muslims on several occasions. Apparently, Indian state authorities do not invest enough effort to protect the Muslim minorities at the ultimate test, the right for life and the sense of security. In addition, the state authorities was quite soft towards the rightist movement that wished to convert India into a Hindu and democratic states. To sum up, the Indian regime indeed can be classified as a hybrid democracy, a compound of several types of regime. I'll explain. As a liberal democracy, India awards its citizens equal civic rights, although, and like all liberal democracies, displays a tendency to assimilate minorities into the majority. India, therefore, provides an environment in which informal attempts to assimilate minorities belonging to the widespread Hindu culture have been initiated, this process termed as Hindutva. As often found in consociational democracies, the Indian state endows autonomy to its minority in the sphere of education and religion. However, this structure perpetuates the segregation of its minority, or what may be consider its excluded communities. The benefits flowing from adoption of consociational regime in deeply divided societies evaporate in India because minorities are not entitled to proportional representation or affirmative action in the political sphere. Moreover, the state often informally functions, as noted, as an ethnic democracy with a preference for its Hindu citizens, and if I may add, as ethnocracy. Furthermore, the fundamental ethos in India have seen several normative transformations since independence. India, which defined itself as a secular democracy and granted its minorities numerous rights, collective and civic, and incorporated their symbols into the state symbols, had come to lean toward ethnic democracy by informally adopting Hindu and nationalist element in its definition of the collective good. This process also expressed in rulings set down by the Supreme Court. The character of India's Supreme Court resembled that beside the governing elite and the security forces, other state institutions tend to adopt a similar approach. Many decisions made by the Indian Supreme Court have equated ideas set forth in the Hindutva and Hinduism with Indianization. One of India's most famous judges, Justice Verma, who wrote the majority of the constitutional decisions during the 90s, has aimed at preserving a unified national culture in which minority culture are simulated within the Hindu way of life. What is termed as the Hindutva ruling seriously challenged the secularism originally professed by Nehru, as they reflect the guiding principle of Indian Hindu societies, principle to which the Supreme Court has lent a receptive ear. Even the most liberal rulings, as the Ayodhya case, which highlights secularism, emphasize how generous the Hindus are towards the others. I can give some more examples during the discussion. The research revealed that the Indian state has attempted to balance the rights granted to its citizens, that is, to create equilibrium between individual and community collective rights. Although we would accept to find that a deeply divided society that declare itself as a state of all its citizens, the minority status would be good, at least better than in ethnic democracy or ethnocracy as Israel. In practice, we find that this case of the Muslim minority in India show us that it is not necessarily so. Citizenship defined by civic and universalistic rather than ethnic or religious criteria, which guarantee a principle of inclusion in India's democracy, has been eroded by majoritarian notions of the nation-state. I have presented here a quick overview of a very complicated political game of give and take that is taking place between these communities in the Indian large fascinating democracies. Thank you.
So we have 25 minutes for discussion, questions. Probably we can collect questions now. We prefer questions instead of statements,
But
please.
maybe you can come to the microphone, or they can bring the microphone to you.
Okay, I will keep the reference. My question is mainly to Dr. or Professor Yiftachel.
Oren.
Oren. But I would be glad to hear any comments. What is the, how can I say, the connection between ethnocracy and the principle of identifying between or equating nationality with ethnicity? I have a feeling it is actually the same, but I would like to.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, of course. Please, sir.
I have a question about India, please. And I have
כן, נאסוף שאלות. אנחנו נאסוף שאלות.
I have recently heard quite a number of lectures by Indian scholars and one of this university, Oren about the relationship between religion and nationalism in India. And my impression was that Hindutva was a new movement which, as described, seemed very right-wing, very nationalist, very exclusive, and almost, I would say, almost modeled on the European fascist and totalitarian movements. Not quite, but in that direction, shall we say. And but from your presentation, I got the impression that this was the sort of official policy of India. So I'd like you to explain that discrepancy. Another thing, now I don't want to sound too critical, but it seems that at one point you described that the government, that the official policy towards the minorities allowed them a certain cultural independence, autonomy, and that, in fact, that made them, that in doing so, the government was, or the official, whatever, was treating them like foreigners. Now, I didn't quite understand. It seems that governments can't do anything right. I mean, if they weren't giving them autonomy, of course, that's very bad. Now they're giving them autonomy, and that makes them foreign. So could you explain that?
Yeah, question. Oren, you said that Tamils boycott elections also because they don't want to legitimize the ethnocratic regime. But how is it going to come to an end? Because in some ways, by not participating, it's legitimizing it anyway. And I can't quite understand that policy anyway.
Let's take another question, then we shall answer. Okay, ask the question, then we shall go to Sam.
Okay, I'm going to ask what may be an unfair question, but I'm intrigued by the research you haven't presented, but you referred to your doctoral thesis, which was of a more comparative nature. If it's not unreasonable, could you perhaps bring to the discussion just one or two of the conclusions that were relevant to the topic of this? Because I am interested in the comparative perspective.
Sami, yes.
I just have a question about. Oh, was it supposed to go to you? Sorry.
I will yield to you.
No.
No, I yield to you.
Brazil. You said that they went to the courts in the United States and that the United States had an interest in cooperating with Brazil and not letting the blacks go there. I didn't quite get that. Why an American court, and what was the American interest?
I would like to ask about Brazil. You said that the nation state or Brazilian nationalism hides the racial divided society, right? Is the nation state real in Brazil? Is it something substantial that it effectively hides? I mean, it's not only effectively hides, maybe it diminishes also the racial divide. I mean, where is it? Just camouflage?
The Brazilians would love you.
No, I'm asking you. I'm not saying that it's a question for Ayelet. Now, it's a federal state. Now, the federal states, what is the basis for federalism? Are the 34 provinces, are they linguistically based? So then you have constitutionalism. You know, by definition, if they are linguistically based, this is ethnicity, and then there is a basic mechanism of constitutionalism.
Ayelet, one question about the religion of India, which I think is cricket rather than Hinduism, that the Islamic community, Muslim community has arrived in India because Muhammad Azharuddin was the captain of the Indian cricket team until very recently. So does not that suggest that those cultural imperatives are overcome by the grassroots acceptance? And Oren, isn't it in Sri Lanka that some of the Sinhalese parties have significant Tamil constituents, and that the Tamil Tigers are the ones that have caused the dissension, for example, by the recent assassination of the Tamil Defence Minister, the minister in the Sinhalese government, and that the problems in Sri Lanka at the moment are that there has been a split in the Tamil Tiger movement, so that the major Tamil party is interested in a devolution, but the rump does not wish to proceed in that direction?
Okay, last question.
I was going to try and formulate a question which linked all three papers together around the issue of how different polities, communities cope with that problem of a more concrete embodied community issue relating to the more abstract state. But I couldn't think of a way of asking that question, so I have to ask Oren a very specific one, which I didn't understand. You said that the ethnocratic state was against the overlapping of nation and state. And is that what you're saying? What seemed to me was that what's happening with the ethnocratic state, which I find is a very powerful concept, is in fact the pushing to the nth degree of the very overlapping of nation and state, which is the overlapping of community and polity, which all three speakers were talking about. So in fact, what they want is a coextensive relationship with that, and I wondered if you could expand upon what that meant, please.
But you need the microphone.
Okay. Regarding the Hindutva and the historical perspective, there were Hindu nationalists in India in all times. For instance, Gandhi was murdered for this reason by a Hindu nationalist, and the right wing is very wide. I mean, you can find there are people that thinks that India is not Hindu enough. I mean, we are the majority. We need to be the leaders of this country, and you can find some fascists that said, okay, we need to expel all the Muslims from India. I mean, there's a wide range of varieties of right-wingers, you can call them. And as for the minorities as foreigners and the collective rights, there is a lot of problems that deviates from giving collective rights to minorities. of course. But India presents itself as a liberal democracy, and it took the Hindu community and it changed all the rules regarding caste, regarding untouchability, regarding the sati, that the wife you need to burn it with the husband, etc., etc. And the Muslim, they don't agree to make any changes in their laws at all, while the Sikh and the Christians made some changes that just making it more appropriate to the democratic state. And also Israel does not interfere with all the religious affairs, but it does set several minimal rules to all communities about the use of marriage and etc., and polygamy, although you can...
It doesn't impose polygamy.
Excuse me?
It doesn't impose on the Muslims, the same as India. It allows.
Formally it does, but informally...
That's what I said.
Okay, but it's different, the formal level and the policy practice. So it seems that in the way it has been in India, it's make the Muslims community seems primitive, and it also, and you can find all the leaders besides Nero. Nero was the only truly secular leader. You can find them talking about the importance of Hinduism and the majority of Hindus, etc., etc., and how we are the state. This is our state, and so on. Some other questions. Regarding the linguistic federalism, of course, you can find many consociational elements in the Indian politics. I don't deny it. But when you examine the major scheme between Hindus and Muslims, the Hindus rejected this idea from the beginning. So in this sense, I deal with the Hindu-Muslim divide, and there are so many interesting schemes in India, but I can't focus on all of them. Regarding the dissertation, it is so complicated. I've made a comparison between the successful cases, India and Israel, and the unsuccessful cases, Cyprus and Sri Lanka. And I've tried to figure out what makes them work and those does not. But regarding India and Israel, what was interesting to find was that the minority in the state of all its citizens, in comparison with the Arab minority in the ethnic democracy, is in a lower status than the Arab population in Israel, but it's more complicated than that. So it's just one generalization of the dissertation. And you'll have to clarify your questions regarding the cricket. I couldn't follow. It was yeah, but I couldn't follow the next question because I thought about the cricket. Yes, I certainly agree that India takes many Muslim symbols and Muslim persons, and maybe they took them as national symbols, actually. But at the end, when you check what do they do during communal violence, for instance, and you can see that the police go and hurt the Muslim people and the government look away when they're killing each other. So this all kinds of acceptance spread away. Please.
I guess I'm going to start just because we're talking about sport and it's a World Cup year.
Falamos a Copa no Brasil.
Okay, so, e a nossa, it's ours.
Soccer is Mondial.
Okay. No, I just want to comment that it's this question of sport and ethnicity. It's an interesting one, and I would actually say that it's one of the areas in which the masking of ethnic divides are most common. It's exactly in the area of sport, in which you have these brief moments in which it appears that everything's going well because you have an individual who, let's say, supersedes the national prejudices and rises to the top. And so, as a kind of a research question, and since I do research on sport, it's one of the areas that I've actually found most intriguing and most complicated, because at least in the research I've done, the more hailing you have of sports figures, and often entertainment figures, if we want to put it in a broader thing, in fact, the more radical you'll find things like police brutality. Okay, so certainly the fact that Pelé was the minister of sport in Brazil in no way should suggest that one being black in Brazil doesn't put you in a different situation than having blonde hair or something like that. Okay, to answer the specific questions I was asked. First of all, the question about why the United States would care about this. This, as we continue to know today, is part of a long legal tradition in the United States having to do with subversives and control. And the United States has, in a legal sense, never juridically accepted the notion that it should export subversives. And this is independent of whether they're citizens or not. And again, we see this today in a place like Guantanamo, but this is another version of it. So the U.S. policy position on this group is, once they were redefined into the communist, right, into this problematic area, the most frightening proposition was that they would actually go to Brazil, where the U.S. would lose control, and they would foment who knows what kind of thing there. This is emphasized in this particular case because of incipient black nationalism having to do with Garveyism and other non-U.S. types of things. So so what you have here is a collusion of interests, although the interests are actually quite different from each other. And the second question, is Brazil a nation state? Or is the nation state real? I guess I'm going to reject the way the question was asked, because the question talks about, it kind of asks for a yes or no answer. And I guess what I would say is, at times the nation state is terribly real, and at times the nation state is terribly false.
How can it be real?
How can it be real?
Abstract notion.
Okay, if I'm, when the police beat me up for marching, I felt the nation state was really present. Okay, okay, I mean, we're playing semantic games now. If you want to call it an extension of power, I'll concede that to you.
And then it's just a state, it's not the nation state.
Again, those of us who work deeply in area studies and talk to these people see the discourses of the nation in the actors of the state quite clearly. In other words, when they hit you on the head saying, this is for Brazil or this is for whatever, the India or Sinhala, perhaps the nation is embedded in those discourses of the state. Okay? But the point I wanted to make is not about the nation states, but was about nationalism, which we yesterday talked about the distinctions between the two. And what I'm trying to argue here, or not argue, but point out, is unlike in almost every case we've discussed here, where we have an ethnic group which sees its future in a nation separate from whatever the constituted, I want to be careful now, the constituted state as it exists. So we're talking about groups which are talking about multiple nations, right? We want the Tamil nation, we want the this nation, we want the that nation. Here, I'm trying to talk about groups of people who are divided, but for whom nationalism, right, is a consistent discourse across these divides. In other words, that Afro-Brazilians who are complaining, right, about prejudice are doing so within a discourse of a belief in Brazilian racial democracy, right? They're not saying we need our own state. They're saying we are the state or the nation, right? To use the terms that you guys are using, and they're in their discourses, right, using the exact same discourses as those they oppose, right? So the ethnic divide and the problem of minority conflict doesn't necessarily lead to divergent nationalism.
All right, 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Hmm?
You need the mic.
So it's an ongoing discussion, probably will continue tomorrow, but just a few comments. On the Chen Azrieli, Yiftachel and Paul questions are really, to some extent, I can answer both about the difference between nationalism, nation-state, overlapping state and nation, and ethnocracy. Ethnocracy, it comes exactly as a critical term to expose the difference. So it is both descriptive and critical in the Gramscian tradition. This is, in a way, separates nationalism from, or nation-state from ethnocracy in a way that nationalism, even if it's in its crudest sense, has a platform of some kind of common denominator to all the people in this territory, right? That's why Brubaker writes about nationalizing state. That is, there is openings, small as they are, sometimes unrealistic, but at least theoretically, they can belong to the inclusive nation. Nationalism has an inclusive property about it, which ethnocracy doesn't. Ethnocracy, from the beginning, builds up those boundaries that even theoretically, there is no possibility of being in the one political community, right? So when Sri Lanka is a Sinhalese state with all the statesmen, all the rules, although it also said at the same time equality, it doesn't allow a Tamil, Hindu Tamil, to be part of the Buddhist state. It's impossible, right? An Arab cannot be a Jew. That is, a Jewish state will always, even though all the rules in the world will say equality, it cannot become part of the ethnic nation. The boundaries will not allow it. And this is exactly the difference between, say, France, that Riva was talking yesterday, which is also an oppressive kind of policy, but it allows the minorities to become French, right? So in that respect, nationalism has or wishes to overlap nation-state quite often by assimilation, right? And Paul, this is for you. Here there's no path of assimilation. So the difference is that a nation-state will try to assimilate the minorities, and ethnocracy, in order to take to the nth degree the overlap of state and nation, will evacuate the minorities, will make them non-citizens, will make them disappear. This is the difference. It will dream, perhaps, of ethnic cleansing.
So they're not against the overlapping, which is what I thought you said. They're actually in favour of the complete overlapping, so it's a one-dimensional ethnic state.
Yeah, it's against the inclusive overlapping. Okay, so this is exactly the difference. Now, there are, of course, I'm not naive, and there are many nation states that, in practice, will find it very, very difficult to integrate. The minorities will find it very difficult to integrate. But as a form of a priori controlling the state and putting boundaries to the minorities, this is what typifies ethnocracy. There is no demos. There is no possibility of a demos. You cannot imagine even the demos, right? There are holes in demos. In Tamils, in Sri Lanka, 1 million Tamils are not even citizens, because they're classified by the Sinhalese state as Indian Tamils. That is, the British brought them in the 19th century to work in the plantations, and because 6 generations ago they were brought there, they're classified in the census as Indian Tamils and will not get citizenship, right? Many of them have already left, but there's still 1 million there. Russians in Estonia didn't get citizenship, right? There is no demos that you can talk about, and of course we know about the Palestinians in Israel or the other minorities in the Greater Serbia dreams, and etc., etc. So there is holes, variated ways in which the demos is prevented. And it's not only prevented within, it also sometimes the diasporas actually are empowered. And that is sometimes diaspora communities are more part of the nation than the local minorities. Of course, each case with its own rich environment and details, but this is the main difference between ethnocracy, and this is why ethnocracy are inherently unstable. And when you look at what I've studied, be it Northern Ireland, or be it Canada before the changes, or be it Spain before the different democratization, or be it Cyprus, Lebanon, Israel, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, when they get to this cross-section, and of course that cross-section could be a decade or two, if they try to democratize and go towards the consociational or accommodation politics, they will normally stabilize with much problem, but they will. And they might choose to continue to oppress the minorities, and then they will continue to be inherently unstable. Boycotting. This is, of course, I've developed a whole conceptual scheme to describe, and this is in the book where you're interested. I classify this as trapped minorities. There is a whole state of being of minorities in ethnocracy that are trapped. That is, they cannot be included, as I said. They will not let them be included, but they cannot opt out, right? There is no way for them to secede. And this is exactly in Sri Lanka. So what are the strategies that minorities in that respect can, one of them is a boycott. Of course, it's a very weak strategy because the majority is not particularly interested. And it's like, I call it like patients that boycott the hospital. The hospital will not matter that much. But nonetheless, for them, for their internal construction of an alternative political path, it's important. And the boycott, I didn't have time to elaborate, but it's of course not complete. It's not complete, as David was saying. There are many Tamils that are part of Sinhalese-dominated parties. There are many Tamils now that live in Colombo. It's mainly the Tamils that claim autonomy or independence that are not willing to take part. And of course it's a bit disastrous. And this is why I want to emphasize that the polarizing effects, because it is what I call negative dialectics. There is oppression, then there is resistance and withdrawal, and then there is more oppression because of that. And so negative dialectics is beginning also to happen in Israel. There was already one boycott in the election, and there's dropping participation rates among the Palestinians that are citizens of Israel, and there is this negative dialectic. And this is, of course, part of understanding ethnocracy, that it's not just the dominance of one ethnic nation, it's the dominance of ethnicity. And when ethnicity is dominant as a factor in society, you rally support quite cheaply by political entrepreneurs by othering the others. It's very, very useful strategy to create the politics of hate, and this in itself is a part of the boycott. Okay, one minute. Perhaps last.
You say your time is the citizenship, but you can't become a part of another ethnicity, but you can be a citizen. Real citizens, Palestinians are citizens of Israel.
Yeah. Okay. You can be a citizen, but to be an inclusive demos with equality and also a sentiment of participation in the national project, it requires more than formal citizenship. And of course, you know that also 30. Okay.
Less citizens of Israel than those Arabs and Muslims who demonstrated in France are citizens of France. It's just the same.
First of all, it's not the same because the Palestinians here are in their homeland. And they are a homeland minority with different attachment and different political agenda. Oh, yeah.
You're avoiding the question by going to this homeland.
You're avoiding the homeland situation, no?
Because we're talking about citizenship.
Yeah.
And not ethnocracy.
No, I was.
I say that from that point of view, leave alone the homeland question for a minute. The rights of the Palestinians as Israeli citizens are no less than the rights of the Muslims as French citizens.
Well, I think they are less. We can do this comparative. I think they are less because the definition of France as France allows them entry as individuals. As the French said, everything is an individual and nothing is a community. It's a different format, but it allows every Muslim in France, including Zinedine Zidane, to be the captain of the football team. It allows them.
Everything is possible.
Yeah. It allows them. Now, I would go along with you, Chedva, to say that practically there could be many barriers. But I think that the Euro situation, the fact that France is constructed as a society where everybody could have a stake, could have participation in, and Israel, by its very definition, or other ethnocracies, don't allow. I think this is a major difference that you highlighted. No, Muslims in France have greater possibilities of political participation and equality than Muslims in Israel or Tamils in Sri Lanka.
I have to conclude. You see what a chair? We just finished in time. So thank you, Ayelet. Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Oren. See you tomorrow, no?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Nice of you to